given that this is the best day of the best instantiation of BCBT ever, well, for those of you whirling around the coffee machine, we're restarting. And we're really lucky to have Aaron Schurger here, because Aaron is revolution personified, you know? And as you also will see during the talk, yes, exactly. Because Aaron is sort of chipping away at this really fundamental problem of conscious will, has really changed the whole playing field of how people now are discussing the study of free will. But he has done that not necessarily by, let's say, big speculation, but really just very solid psychophysical and computational work. And it makes him really an outstanding exemplar of the research tradition where you try to bring the sort of theoretical computational approaches together with experimental work. So, Aaron, it's great that you're here. I look forward to your talk.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm not sure I deserve all that praise.
No, it's all lies, but it sounds good.
It sounds good, yeah.
That's how it works.
What should it be? Brings me joy? Is that joy or bliss? Or pride?
As Joshua, he knows.
Yeah. All right. So, as the title implies, I'm going to talk about volition, voluntary action. The first part of the talk, I'm going to go through a little bit of history and tell you about some, well, what Paul just was talking about, how we've tried to change a bit the way people are thinking about some of the brain signals that are associated with voluntary behavior and volition. And then in the latter part of the talk, I'll talk about some other studies on the same theme and kind of collect some caveats about what to pay attention to when you're evaluating research that claims to be about conscious will, and what kind of tools do you need to be able to say something about it? Because in theory, right? In theory, science could disprove free will, right? It's one thing it's one thing to say that we do or don't have free will based on a rational argument. It's another thing to say I have evidence, right? We could have evidence against it. It's another trick to have evidence in favor. So I say in the title, conscious will. Why not free will, right? The problem there is that free will is something that's a bit tricky to define. And a lot of people would argue that it's ill-defined, right? In the limit, what we like to think of as free will is an uncaused cause. So it's really hard to grapple with that scientifically. But we can at least talk about conscious will. We can ask whether or not conscious brain states intervene in the causal path between some sort of neural decision and an upcoming action. So the big question in the field, and the one that's been dominant for decades, is if you look at this timeline between neural decision and action, right? The neural decision being some event that happens in the brain that is causally related to the action. What we want to know is where does this conscious decision or this conscious intention land on that timeline? If it comes before the neural decision, well, that feels right. That's what we associate with the idea of free will, right? I make a conscious decision, and then something happens in my brain that leads to an action. But if it looks as if the conscious decision is happening after the brain initiates the action, that undermines our belief in free will. So this is sort of the key question in the field. It's the one that gets people excited and gets people talking and has stirred a lot of controversy. So of course, when it comes to conscious will, it helps to make a distinction between two different classes of actions. stimulus-cued actions. So, for example, the telephone rings and you answer it, or the traffic light turns red and you press on the brakes, or a mosquito lands on you and you swat it, versus self-initiated actions, which are actions that aren't immediately triggered by some sensory cue. So, for example, my cat will sometimes be laying around and then will spontaneously start grooming himself. So he'll undergo this behavioral state transition from resting to grooming. Right? Why did he pick that particular moment? Or you're reading the newspaper in the morning, and at a given moment you reach out to take your cup of coffee and take the next sip of coffee. Or you decide, I think I'm going to call my mother. And so you pick up the phone and call your mother. So this isn't sufficient for volition, but it's necessary, I think, to be, if we're going to call something an act of conscious will, it's going to be this kind of action. It's going to be what we, for lack of a better phrase, call a self-initiated action. So what we've been looking at in the research that I've been doing is trying to identify when does this magical moment happen in the brain relative to the beginning of the action. So when is the dividing moment between not moving and moving? What I call the neural decision to move. Yeah?
Regarding the distinction that you made earlier, would you consider like an action that, if you have like a stimulus that is like leading to an action, but let's say that you just have the stimulus, but then you have the freedom to choose what action to take. So the action is not explicitly signaled by the environment. Would that be considered like free will, like a self-initiated action, or?
Well, it's not in the category of a stimulus-cued action.
Okay.
Let's say, let's think of an example maybe. You're asked in an experiment to add or subtract two numbers, right? So that would, what we mean by self-initiated is that you choose the when.
Okay.
So the when is not specified.
But it's not the what.
Not in the experiments that I'm talking about here.
Okay. But in general, would you include the what also as a?
Yeah. So
okay.
I would definitely include what.
Like if I have like a red light, like at the crossroad, no, the light is red. I have the choice to either stop or run.
Right.
Is that free will? Is it considered like?
Yeah, it's an act. That could be considered an act of conscious will.
Okay.
I guess. But you wouldn't want to assign. You wouldn't want to. You would give free will a bad name if you assign very simple actions to, reflexive actions and call them acts of free will. So this, what I call the neural decision to move, or you could say the neural decision to move now, is the proximal neural event that commits some part of the body to an imminent movement. So down at the bottom I have it, some event, E, presumably in the brain, such that the probability of movement in the near future given that event is roughly 1, right? It's a commitment. So I say it's roughly 1. It's not 1 because you could be struck by lightning just as you're about to initiate the movement. But you've made a commitment, so if nothing gets in the way of you making the movement, it will happen, right? So why do we care about these kind of movements? What's the interest? Well, it's relevant to a lot of different things like pathological gambling, crime. So in assigning blame in legal circles, right? You've maybe heard of the concept of mens rea. So if you commit a crime, well, it's one thing to know that your body was responsible for committing that crime, but what people in the legal profession also look for is they go back in time and look to see if there was a conscious intention in the brain that preceded that you meant to do it, right? In a sense. Other contexts like when to buy or sell a stock, and importantly, the development of brain-computer interfaces, asynchronous brain-computer interfaces, to be more specific. So it's one thing for this brain-computer interface to know what the subject wants to do. It's another thing for the interface to know when they want to act and not respond otherwise, right? This is, brain-computer interfaces have evolved a lot in the last 10 years, but this is the one big outstanding problem, is this problem of when, right? So imagine that you're trying to make a brain-computer interface that can, just by you thinking about it, can type words for you, can take sort of mental dictation. How is it to know the difference between you thinking about what you want to write and you actually wanting to write it? Because everything in this case is in the domain of thought, right? So you wouldn't want this thing to start writing until you intended for there to be some writing happening. You wouldn't want it to start writing just when you were musing about what you were going to write. So what we know about self-initiated movement is largely descriptive in nature. And surprisingly, we don't know a whole lot. We know that the basal ganglia are involved, that areas of the medial wall of the motor cortex, like the SMA, are prominently involved, possibly areas of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But we still lack a really mechanistic account of how self-initiated actions come about. One of the most important pieces of knowledge, and maybe one of the most misinterpreted pieces of knowledge, came from this study in the 1960s, 1965, Kornhuber and Baker. And for those who don't read German, I've got the title there in English. They were one of the first to ask their subjects to perform an action without a stimulus. So they asked their subjects to perform self-paced or uncued movements. Try not to be rhythmic, right? But make your movements at irregular intervals, and pause at least about 15 seconds in between movements. This was to allow time for them to deal with the EEG, which at the time, by the way, they recorded with this kind of reel-to-reel tape. And when the movement happened, they stopped the tape and then flipped them over and played them backwards in order to recover the signal. That was what they had to do at the time, so it's pretty amazing. What they found was that just before someone makes one of these self-initiated movements, for no good reason really, right, other than that they were instructed to do so, is this telltale buildup of neural activity over motor areas that precedes the onset of the movement by up to a second or more. And they call it the Bereitschafts potential, or the readiness potential. And by the way, this is a negative. If you're recording from motor cortex with a reference, say like they had on the tip of the nose, this will be negative. But in the day, and it's still common to plot negative up. So just in case that's confusing. So let's see. Whatever. Okay. So there's been a fair bit of controversy about what this means, but one thing has sort of stayed, which is the general interpretation of this is that it's the electrophysiological sign of planning, preparation, and initiation of voluntary acts. People largely agree on that. It's been, since the time that it was discovered, it's been found in primates, rodents, and even in crayfish. And then when you record it, they call it a readiness discharge when you record it with an invasive electrode, but it's the same thing, right? You could call it a pre-movement buildup. That's what I call it. It's also been recorded in the cortex of epilepsy patients with implanted electrodes. So you see that it does correspond to an increase in firing rate of individual neurons. Just in case there was any doubt about that, that work was done in 2011. I'll talk a bit about that later. I think the work on the crayfish is particularly interesting to me because the crayfish doesn't have any motor cortex. It doesn't have any cortex at all. So the fact that it has the same phenomenon of a buildup before what you could call a behavioral state transition means that this is maybe something very primitive, right? Very fundamental phenomenon. Maybe not something that's specific. Well, certainly not something that's specific to vertebrates. So what they do in these experiments, the crayfish is in water and he's he's sitting on top of a ball and he's held head fixed with a recording electrode, and as he moves his legs, the ball spins in the opposite direction underneath him, so he feels like he's moving. And what this little guy will do is he'll sit and rest for a while, and then at a certain moment he'll start foraging, start looking around. And it's at these transitions between rest and foraging that you get this characteristic buildup of firing rate in what is sort of a motor area of this guy's brain. So I'll come back to that a little bit later, but I just wanted to, yeah.
Is it time scale?
Yes, I left out the time scale, but that ramping up is about 5 seconds.
So it's comparable with a human?
Yeah, it's on the order of seconds. Yeah.
Wow.
That's one of the things I found really fascinating about this work. It's like, wait, right? So about 20 years after the discovery of the readiness potential, a neuroscientist by the name of Benjamin Libet did a famous study which made use of the readiness potential. How many have heard of the Libet experiment? Has anyone heard of it? Oh, a lot of people. Okay. All right, good. So Libet asked his subjects to make self-initiated movements as well while he recorded EEG. But he just added one element. He had this clock with a rapidly rotating dot on it. The dot would go once around the clock about every 3 seconds. So it's about 50 milliseconds per second on the clock. And the subjects were instructed to use this clock to time their own conscious urge to initiate the movement. So they would watch the clock, they would sit there, and at a spontaneous moment, oops, they would lift their finger, and they were to note the time. Where was the dot on the clock when you were first aware of your urge to initiate the movement? And of course, the upshot of this experiment, which is now famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, is that the readiness potential, as it is reliably, it started maybe sometimes a second before the movement. Whereas the conscious decision, if you average these subjects' reports about the position of the dot on the clock, they clocked in at about 200 milliseconds before the movement. So a long time after this readiness potential appears to begin. So it looks as if the brain has already decided to initiate this movement before you're conscious of having decided to initiate the movement. So what does that mean? It was interpreted to mean that, well, we're not conscious actors, right? We act, and then the conscious feeling of an urge or an intention to act is something that's just tacked on after the fact in order to make us feel good, or in order to make us feel like we're in control. So this here I've caricatured as the sort of prevailing view today with these dominoes. So you have this decision with, yes?
I just want to ask, is it sometimes happening that the RP is starting and that it's interrupted so that the movement is stopped before it happens?
Yeah, in fact, Libet even did this kind of experiment, and you can still record a readiness potential when you have people kind of get ready to do an action and then don't do it at the last minute. Is that what you were asking? Do you still, you still get something like a readiness potential.
And is it stopping before the consciousness, before it gets consciousness? Before the conscious urge. If you go one slide back,
Yeah, let me see.
the interaction, does it happen before the orange line or after?
I'm not sure that he recorded, so, because if you ask people to intend to do an action but then don't do it, it's a bit difficult to time the conscious urge in that case.
And even if it's unintended?
Oh, if it's unintended, that would be a different story, but then how would you do that? I don't know.
Would
Yeah.
I mean, maybe similar to her question. Would you expect to see something similar also like in the in the opposite, so like the inhibition. Let's say that you're doing like a continuous action.
Mhm.
I don't know if that makes sense to you, and you can like voluntarily decide when to stop.
Yeah.
Would you get something like this as well?
Yeah, so you can you get something like that when you, in general, when there's any kind of behavioral state transition.
Okay.
Put it that way.
Okay.
I think that's the better way to put it than rather than saying the initiation of a movement, right? Like with the crayfish, he's in a resting state, and then he transitions to a moving state. I assume that, for example, if you were recording from someone while they were typing on a keyboard, I don't think you get a readiness potential before every single key press.
You don't.
You'd get a readiness.
I can tell you that you don't.
You don't. Okay, yeah. You get a readiness potential when there's a transition from not typing at all to typing,
Right.
and then from typing to not typing at all again. Probably that's where you get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the prevailing view of the readiness potential and the events that happen on the sort of same time scale. You have this decision, which is far back in time, in neural terms, maybe a second before or even longer, and the rest is just outcome, right? Is outcome of the decision, and somewhere relatively late in the game is when the self becomes conscious of the decision making. So in the time since the readiness potential was discovered, people have asked questions like, well, where does it start? Right? Where does the readiness potential start here or here? It's kind of curvy, so it's hard to say it starts anywhere, right? You can do arbitrary things like say, well, when does it first become significantly different from the noise? Things like that. People have also tried to fit it in different piecewise ways, saying, for example, well, there's an early part of the readiness potential and a late part, or maybe there's an early part and a middle part and a late part. So we've used some more sophisticated fitting methods on the readiness potential and found that it's really well fit by a banana. So the point here is that you can fit this all sorts of ways, and you can ask whether it begins, where it begins, or what kind of phases it have, different phases it's constructed of. But ultimately, this reflects some assumptions that you're making about what this thing means. And so I'm going to try and lay out a different perspective on the readiness potential that challenges some of those assumptions. And I'll show you some data that we collected that supports this perspective. So in order to get the point across, I'm just going to go through a simple thought experiment. So it's just a thought experiment. I didn't actually do this experiment, but I did do these simulations. So I coded this up and did these simulations based on this thought experiment. So the thought experiment goes like this. It's flu season, and you're interested in the etiology of the flu. You're interested in what happens before the onset of the flu. Right? And so each participant in your cohort wears a bracelet that's keeping track of their health minute by minute. Right? We have these now, I guess, Fitbit, something like that. But something more sophisticated that's keeping track of your overall health points, like your life points in a video game. Right? And then if you come down with the flu, you press a button, and that marks the point in time when well, this is when I first realized that I had the flu. So I first had some symptoms. Then you turn these in at the end of flu season, and we look at them, line up the data according to when you first when you press the button, when you first had your symptoms of the flu, and look at what's happening, right? What's happening to your health score before that. So here are a few sample traces from some members of this population, and I'm going to point out some obvious things about these traces. One is that well, you can see where they come down with the flu, right? Their health point, where the red arrows are. So their health points drop, they stay sick for a while, and then they get better. So what's happening before and after that, you notice that these lines are not flat, right? Your health score is varying in a random way, even when you don't have the flu, right? So your health, maybe you went to the gym one day and you ate really well, you ate healthy food, and your health points went up a little bit. Maybe you went out drinking, and the next day it went down, and so on. The other obvious point I want to make about this is that in this slide, everybody came down with the flu. Well, it's not it's not true that everybody in the sample came down with the flu, right? A lot of people go through the whole flu season, they never come down with the flu. The point I'm making here is that, well, because we're interested in what happens before you come down with the flu, we've just set us, we're not looking at those data, right? Those people who didn't come down with the flu, we just put their bracelets aside. We don't care, so we're looking at the data in a sort of a strange way without realizing it, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So when we take these, just like we do with the readiness potential, when we take these data epochs and align them to the, say, onset of symptoms, and then take the average, we get something that looks like this. And this is just what falls out if you do this in a simple simulation, right? So it looks like your health score is already coming down, on its way down for a few days before the onset of symptoms. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing too strange about that, except that in this thought experiment, we know everything, right? It's a thought experiment, so we know when they came in contact with the virus, which is the reason they got the flu, and that happens here. So when you see that, now you know something does look strange, because it looks as if they were getting sicker even before they came in contact with the virus. So one naive interpretation of that might be, well, their immune system is prescient, it knows the future, it knows that you're going to come in contact with the virus in a few days, and it decides, well, I might as well get the ball rolling in advance, right? It's going to happen anyway. But we know better. The answer lies in the fact that you don't come down with the flu just because you come in contact with the virus, but you come down with the flu. All these blue arrows are when you came in contact with the virus and didn't get the flu, right? You come down with the flu when you come in contact with the virus and your health is already kind of on its way down already a little bit, just for random reasons, right? Because of those fluctuations that I pointed out. And so if you time lock these and take the average, you get what looks like this. And so you could say, oh, well, this is a case of these intrinsic fluctuations being caught in the flash photo of event-locked averaging. So it looks like something was decided, but in fact nothing was decided back in time, right? So there ends the thought experiment. This is just to sort of prime your intuition. As people ask, oh, well, what does the virus correspond to? That's the end of the thought experiment. Right? If you got the intuition, then it served its purpose, and you can set it aside. So the idea I found when I was doing some research is not entirely new. John Eccles, in his work with the philosopher Popper, talked about something very much like this. He said that there is a tendency for the initiation of the movements to occur during the excitatory phases of the random spontaneous activity. The earlier phase of the RP, the readiness potential, up to about 200 milliseconds before the movement, would then reflect this spontaneous activity. Of course, this pretty much says it all. The reason that this was promptly ignored was because Eccles was a dualist. Right? Behind this, he was saying that there's this soul hanging out there, and the soul kind of jumps in and rides the wave. So this hypothesis implies that spontaneous fluctuations, like those reflected in the earlier part of the RP, should have regularly occur, independently of any intention or movement, so as to allow the production of voluntary acts. So do we have these kind of spontaneous fluctuations in neural activity? And the answer is absolutely, right? When you have someone, when you say you're recording EEG from someone who's doing nothing, just sitting there, you get a trace that looks like this one on the top. And whoops. Okay, yeah. And an important thing to point out is that the kind of noise that you see in brain and behavior across a whole range of spatial scales is autocorrelated. It looks like this, right? It's pinkish. It has this kind of power spectrum. The power spectrum is you don't have equal power in all frequencies like you do with white noise. So if you see white noise coming out of your neural recording apparatus, something's not right. So yes, So we started with this simple premise, which is that the brain uses the same mechanism for decision making in Libet's task or a task like his that it would in any decision making task, accumulation of evidence to a threshold. Except in this case, there is no evidence per se, right? You're just telling the person sort of move whenever you want to. So in place of evidence, we have mostly internal noise, random fluctuations, and a weak imperative to move. So what I mean by that is sort of the white coat syndrome, or the demand characteristics of the tasks. The subjects come in, and you tell them you can move whenever you want to. You can perform this spontaneous movement whenever you want to. So, and I tell the subjects there are no rules. Just when you want to, don't ask. So you've given them permission to wait a minute, an hour, to never move at all, right? They're free to do any of those things, but in having run lots of subjects on this task, nobody ever waits longer than about 20 or 30 seconds to produce a movement. Why that is, I presume, is because they know they're there for an experiment about making movements. You've asked them, you've told them what the task is, and so at some implicit level, they know, well, I better move sooner or later, right? So there's a weak imperative to move. It's not, it doesn't, that imperative isn't strong enough to fix the exact time of the movement, like it would be the case if I told them, move when you see the green light, right? So they have a certain amount of freedom, right, to decide when they move. So this is just an example of a simple accumulator model that is typically used in research on perception. So for example, you have a blank screen here, and let's see if I can, yeah, you have a blank screen, and then at some point there's this very faint Gabor patch that comes on, so this is the evidence, and the model just sort of integrates this evidence, and then when it reaches a threshold, the animal or the person reaches out and presses a button or responds in some way or another. So this looks very linear, but when the evidence is very weak, which I was saying is the case in this context, then things look more like this. So this is an accumulator. These are some traces from an accumulator that's driven mostly by noise with very little quote-unquote evidence. Right? So these traces look a lot like spontaneous resting activity. So the second premise was that when the imperative to produce a movement is weak or absent, the precise moment at which the decision threshold is crossed is largely determined by spontaneous subthreshold fluctuations in neural activity. So if this blue line here is the threshold, in a noiseless system you would have crossed the threshold somewhere over here, but because there are these spontaneous fluctuations, you happen to cross it here. And so if you time lock then to the threshold crossing, you tend to recover something like the autocorrelation function of the noise in the average. So this led us to create this simple, what's called a leaky stochastic accumulator. It's very similar to a drift diffusion model. It has a term for what's called drift in physics, or corresponds to the imperative in our case. There's leak, which makes this more biologically realistic, and there's noise, and then there's a threshold on X. So what this does when you start this simulation at 0 is it kind of, on average, right? These are many traces sort of superimposed, but on average it climbs up to a level where the distribution becomes stationary. That's given by the ratio between I and K, and then at some point it randomly crosses the threshold, right? And so we can look at the shape of this thing as it approaches the threshold, and we can also look at the distribution of these first crossing times. So what these two things correspond to in a real experiment, these correspond to the distribution of waiting times, how long the subject waited before they performed their movement, and the trajectory of this decision variable as it's approaching the threshold, we presume corresponds to this readiness potential, this signal that we reported. And lo and behold, if you take lots of these and you time lock to the threshold crossing, and you look at the average trajectory, it looks an awful lot like the readiness potential. This is just an average over output from the simulation. So we did Libet's experiment. We recorded EEG and behavioral data from subjects doing his task. And using the model, we were able to fit the behavioral data, so the distribution of waiting times, using the distribution of first crossing times of the model. And fixing the parameters there, we got a really excellent fit on the readiness potential. Right? So suggesting that this could explain this long early tail, and highly variable, by the way, tail of the readiness potential. Because from one subject to the next, sometimes the readiness potential kind of trails back in time half a second, sometimes 1 second, sometimes 1.5 or even 2 seconds. It's it's highly variable across subjects and experiments, which should arouse suspicion, right? It did in our case, at least. So we wanted to test the model in a more direct way. So we said, well, what kind of experiment does the model suggest that we do? Does it make a novel prediction? So here's one novel prediction that the model made. We have subjects do the standard Libet task for about 20 minutes. And then after they're done doing that, we switch. We tell them, okay, we're going to do the same task again, but this time you might be interrupted by a little click. So you do the Libet task. If you don't hear the click, you make your spontaneous movement, and that's all fine and good. If you happen to hear the click before you move, then perform the movement itself as quickly as you possibly can in response to the click. Right. So the prediction from this is given by this slide here. So here's the threshold, and here's some spontaneous fluctuations. And if, for example, we interrupted the subject here, then their reaction time is given by how far this happens to be from threshold at the time that we interrupt them. If we interrupted them here, their reaction time will be that much faster because they're already that much closer to the threshold, right? And then occasionally they make the spontaneous movement before they're interrupted, in which case there is no interruption on that trial. So the prediction here, to be more precise, is that fast reaction times to these interruptions should be preceded by a buildup in signal amplitude, beginning well before the interruption itself, even when the subject was not preparing to move at that particular moment. And that's precisely what we found. So you can hear the data time locked to the movement, hear the data time locked to the click, and in the top row, this is the empirical EEG data, and the bottom row, this is what the model told us. So if you just look, you can focus on data time locked to the click. You see, even before the subject was interrupted, there's already something that's significantly more negative when the response to the click was fast rather than slow. So we separated the upper and lower third of the reaction times to the click. That corresponds to the orange and the gray lines. What's interesting too is that this looks very linear. It doesn't look like the readiness potential. It almost looks like it's not far from being a DC offset, and that's exactly what the model suggested. We weren't expecting that. I was expecting this to look something like the readiness potential, but it didn't. And this is what the model predicted, and this is what we got. So this is our sort of different interpretation of the readiness potential. What's happening before about 150 or 200 milliseconds prior to the onset of movement is accounted for by spontaneous fluctuations. And then at about that time, at about 200 milliseconds before the movement, maybe 150, is the actual decision to move, right? Given by a threshold crossing event. What's interesting about that time, 150, 200 milliseconds before movement, is that just happens to be the time that Libet's subjects and in the times that this experiment's been replicated since then, it replicates really well. That's the time that subjects report having had the urge to initiate the movement. It's about 200 milliseconds before. So maybe Libet's mistake was not to take his subjects at their word, right? They said that they felt the urge to move at about 200 milliseconds before the movement. Maybe that's because the brain is telling you something veridical in response to that question. It's trying to tell you when the decision happened, when this threshold crossing event happened. And maybe it's a noisy estimate, but it seems that it might be reasonably accurate. Libet saw the tail of the readiness potential going back much further in time, and presumed, well, then my subjects must be wrong about the time of their decision, but maybe they weren't. So here, these are some studies that have come out since ours that lend support to this interpretation of the readiness potential. I want to just...
but now, Aaron, before we go into it, if you go back to your comparison of the data you got in your model, right? So, if I sort of close my eyes a bit, then I say, okay, it looks similar. But if I start to look at details, there are also important differences, right?
Okay.
So to what extent should we be concerned about those differences? Because you see the slope that the model indicates for the fast trials is rather dramatically different than what you see in the real data, where the slope of the two curves looks rather similar. Right? This might suggest that in that sense, let's say some time constant that the model is using is rather different from the one that is actually deployed by the brain. So should we worry about, is this a problem for your model, or for now we should forget about that difference?
I think for now it's not that important, right?
Okay.
I think the key is that the model predicts a difference, and it predicts it in a certain direction. And it's, again, I think, interesting that in both cases, the trajectory is relatively linear. It doesn't look like readiness potential. It's as if you're sampling it's as if you're sampling the process that gives rise to the readiness potential at different points in time. Yeah.
Doesn't the study suggest that the Libet experiment isn't about decision-making at all?
Right.
It's about observing a random process that occasionally spikes over a threshold.
That's what I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about as we were designing these experiments was, I thought, well, why don't I take a step back, stop thinking about how it feels subjectively to do this task. Rather, instead, think about how, if I had to engineer a robotic arm that could do this task, how would I do it? And I decided then that I should go with the simplest answer. So the simplest answer I could think of was that I just take advantage of the noise in my actuator. I know no matter how much I spend on it, it'll have some noise, right? And just increase the activity to being close to the threshold, and then just wait. And the robotic arm will make a spontaneous movement, right? So yes, and I think that at least partly explains what's happening in the Libet task. So of course, I don't deny that there are other factors. Like when you do the task, you can't help it. You're watching the clock, and let's say on the last trial you made your movement at the bottom of the clock. Then on the next trial you might be thinking, well, maybe I should shake things up a little bit and move at a different point on the clock, right? So there's some strategizing that probably goes on as well, and there are probably lots of other factors that influence precisely when you move. The point is that spontaneous fluctuations might be one of those factors, right? And might be the factor that give rise to this long tail of this EEG.
Yeah, but now there's a problem, right? Because if the only aspect of the data that matters is this difference in offset, right? Then I might also come up with a model that is not doing any kind of spontaneous fluctuation. I might have just an oscillator that can switch itself in two modes, right? Where it either oscillates at a somewhat higher frequency or a lower frequency, as an example. So I don't need integration, I don't need spontaneous fluctuation.
I'm not sure that would give you this shape trajectory, though.
Okay, to be discussed then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just quickly, I'll mention this study, a very good one that came out in 2014. This is Murakami and from Zach Manin's group. So there's a rat is doing this simple task where he can puts his nose in a little waiting port, and there's a tone that he has to wait for that says to start the trial. So there's tone number 1 that says this is the beginning of the trial, and then the rat has to wait for the second tone. And if he waits for the second tone and then goes to the reward port, at that time he gets a nice big reward. But the interval between these two tones is highly variable. Sometimes it's much longer, and the rat is allowed actually to jump the gun and move to the reward port before the second tone happens. And this happens when the interval happens to be a little particularly long. The rat gives up waiting, goes to the reward port, and he's guaranteed a small reward at that point. So it's a trade-off between waiting for a large reward or moving now for a smaller reward. What is important about the task is that this movement of the rat on the impatient trials is a self-initiated movement. So the time of the movement isn't specified by any stimulus in the setup. And what they find, interestingly enough, in premotor neurons, in area M2 of the rat, are these ramping signals that precede the moment when the rat, on impatient trials, the moment when the rat leaves the waiting port and moves to the reward port. And the activity of these, the level of activity of these neurons predicts precisely when the rat leaves the waiting port. And they found another population of neurons interspersed there. These look like the output of an accumulator, right? They reach a certain threshold and then you move. They found another subpopulation of neurons interspersed with these, whose behavior looks like the input to the neuron. Their tonic, noisy firing rate predicted not precisely when the rat left the waiting port, but how long the rat waited. So if you look at their average firing rate across the trial, it predicts pretty well how long the rat waited before leaving. So they found essentially one population of neurons that looks like the inputs to an accumulator, and another population interspersed with those that looks like the output of an accumulation process. And here's what they say in their paper, that bounded integration models identify the initial intention to act as the moment of threshold crossing, while explaining how antecedent subthreshold neural activity can influence an action without implying a decision. So I couldn't have said it better myself. So I put it.
But so why do you highlight this experiment? Because there's a lot of experiments out there that support the idea of drift diffusion.
Right, because but this supports it in not in a perceptual decision-making task, but in a spontaneous movement initiation task. Right, that's the key difference. This is one of the first to use that kind of model in that context.
Well, there's a tone. The tone does control a little bit the decision-making process.
Well, the first tone tells you that the trial has started, and you're just waiting. But there's plenty of variability in how long the rat waits before leaving.
How long could they wait? What was the whole total window?
I forget what the total window could have been some tens of seconds, I think. I mean, in other words, at the longest, it was a long-tailed distribution that they were sampling from, but the rat, it could end up waiting, say, 15 seconds or 20 seconds. Long enough that a fair amount of the time the rat would just get impatient and decide to go for the small reward. Okay, so that's the gist of this sort of alternative view of the readiness potential that I think is gaining some ground. I talked in the beginning about the Itzhak Fried study in 2011, where they recorded the readiness discharge from epilepsy patients who had electrodes implanted in their premotor cortex. So everything I've said sounds good, right? But how can you argue with this? So what they did was they used a support vector machine in a sort of a sliding window to try and predict the onset of movement, or what they said to predict volition in advance, based on the firing pattern across the population of neurons that they were reporting from. And you see that as early as even half a second before the movement, according to this plot, they're quite a bit above chance in predicting what's going to happen next. In a sense, predicting when the movement is going to happen. But in this case, the devil is really in the details. So they did this kind of sliding window classification. So you have a window that the classifier only sees what's in the window, and then the classifier has to make some prediction about what's going to happen in the future based on what's in the window. But so one thing, just that we can get out of the way, is that the window was 400 milliseconds wide, and they aligned the time axis here to the middle of the window, which means that their classifier was allowed to peak 200 milliseconds into the future, right? You shouldn't align to the middle of the window. For various reasons, it seems intuitive, oh yeah, you align to the middle of the window because that's the most sensible point. But when you're trying to predict the future, then no, you're not allowed to do that, right? So here's the time axis when you adjust it. So this is really more like 300 milliseconds before when you get this pretty good level of performance. That at least changes things a little bit. So I'm going to start to make a little list of caveats that we should be careful to. So align to the leading edge of the sliding window when you do this kind of analysis. But that's not the only problem. So one of the other problems that could come up here is due to autocorrelation, which, as I said, is a feature of most neural and behavioral time series. So to bring this point home, say that when we do these kind of experiments with any kind of experiment involving movement, or any experiment in general for that matter, we want to have some epochs with the phenomenon we're interested in. So in this case, epochs with movement and some epochs without movement, and we want to compare them. Right? That would be a sensible way to go about this. But in these kind of experiments, we don't have these epochs without movement. As I pointed out in the flu example, right? The subjects who didn't come down with the flu, what do we do with them, right? We just set them aside because we use the onset of symptoms as our temporal marker when we extract our epochs. So the same is true with studies of self-initiated movement. You use the movement itself, the time of the movement, as your trigger, say, or your temporal marker. So what you can do, and what they did, is you say, well, okay, we only have these epochs with movement, but what we can do is we can take a remote baseline and consider that to be the negative examples, the no movement examples, and then take some other little window that we slide back and forth and call that the positive example. And we can say, as we slide this red window closer and closer to the time of movement, how well can we tell this apart from the quote-unquote baseline? But that's problematic because if the data are autocorrelated, means that if it reaches a threshold, it had to climb up gradually, right? So it's the reason why, for example, with meteorological phenomena, that you can ask somebody, well, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? And if you just say same as today, right, you'll be right far more often than chance. That doesn't mean you know anything in particular about tomorrow's weather. It means you just know something in general about the weather, which is that it's autocorrelated, right? That it has a sort of sluggish memory. So I tested that using the model. What I did was I just generated random time series from the model. And I used this very same technique with a remote baseline, and I tried to predict threshold crossings, right? using an even simpler classifier than they did. I just used a Gaussian naive Bayes classifier. And of course, it looks like in simulation time, so even back as far as a half a second or a second, I'm already way above chance in predicting the future. But of course, the mistake here is to think that the null hypothesis, or the null distribution, is 0.5. In this case, the model that you should be, you should consider the null model is this. This is the null hypothesis because of the presence of autocorrelation. We know that the data are autocorrelated, right? So you have to beat this. You don't just have to beat 0.5, right? And I've talked to people who do weather research, and they're like, well, duh, of course, right? This is what they do. They've been doing this for decades, a lot longer than we've been doing the same kind of thing in neuroscience. So we tried to set up an experiment where we had these epochs without movement. And I did this work with Rob Shapiro, who at the time was at Princeton. He's now working for Microsoft Research. He developed AdaBoost. Is anybody familiar with AdaBoost? It's a machine learning meta algorithm. And his student Mehmet Bashbag. And so we recorded MEG and EEG data, magneto and electroencephalography data simultaneously while subjects did this simple task. They just looked at a slideshow of pretty pictures. So pictures of nature scenes, nothing offensive, nothing scary. And there were sort of two kinds of slide transition. There was a manual slide transition and an automatic slide transition. So before the slide appeared, the subject saw either the word manual or automatic on the screen. If you saw the word manual, it means you look at the slide, you look at the picture, and have your feel of enjoying this pretty picture. And when you're ready, you press the button, or in this case, lift your finger, and the slide will advance. On the other hand, if it says auto, it says automatic, it means you don't move your hand, just wait passively, and it will change. The slide will transition by itself. And importantly, we sort of bootstrapped the viewing time on these automatic trials was drawn from the subject's own viewing time distribution on the manual trial, so that by the end of the experiment, we have these two sets of data. They're both aligned to an event, the slide transition, but in one case the event is triggered by a movement, and in one case it's triggered just by passively waiting. So this then gives us what we wanted, these two kinds of data with a movement and data without a movement, right? That we can then compare. And what we predicted here was that the movement would not be so easy to predict, in fact, because these may have a lot more in common than they don't. One important thing they have in common is anticipation. So you're waiting for something to happen. In one case, you're making it happen. In another case, it's happening by itself, but you're anticipating the slide transition. So this just shows a sort of theoretical, sketchy sort of model of what the performance of the classifier might look like as a function of time, trying to tell these apart. So maybe Libet might say, well, it should look like this, right? The decision is made early, right? So if the fact of moving at time 0 is fixed, right? If you really have committed to it, then maybe AdaBoost should pick that up, and this thing will reach a plateau somewhere quite early, right? On the other hand, if the decision is late, then the curve might look like this, which is what we predicted. And of course, it may or may not get that close to 1, to perfect prediction, but that's just, we can account for that as measurement error. You can say, well, the elbow here, the point at which it reaches the plateau, is our surrogate for when the decision happened. Right? When was the neural decision to move? So here's, So in white here is the sliding window. And these are just two example features that AdaBoost picked out. In blue is a feature that it picked out for positive examples, and in green is a feature it picked for negative examples. And so I'll just play this movie, you'll see the window sliding across, and as it's sliding across, you can see here's the ROC curve that's giving you the performance of the classifier. Let's see if this one. It's not doing anything, is it?
Oh, depends what you were expecting.
Says it, yeah, median not found. Well, that's okay, because on the next slide I have the average. So this is what the curve looks like. It really, it's not until very close to the onset of movement that we're able to tell them apart. Importantly, we're able to tell them apart exceedingly well at and after the time of movement. So it certainly isn't a problem with AdaBoost not being able to pick up relevant signals. It's able to pick up the signal well enough to classify it near perfect accuracy. Part of the reason for this is because we had a small number of subjects. We just had these 3 subjects who came back from multiple sessions. So we had lots of trials per subject, which AdaBoost likes. But importantly, the time course of this thing does not look like the readiness potential. It doesn't have this long tail, and it certainly doesn't look like this. Well, which do you believe? I'll leave it up to you. We went ahead and redid this analysis, this time on real data, not synthetic data. We redid this analysis using this baseline technique, where we chose a remote baseline and then compared a sliding window to that baseline, right, at various positions for the sliding window. And when we do that, we get these red curves. These are our 3 subjects. So suddenly, we've turned into Nostradamus. We can tell the future, right? When you use that trick. These are 4 other subjects that we had come back just for 1 session each, just to make sure that these 3 were not outliers. So the point here, the key point here, is that sampling the conditions that are active when a movement is not about to happen is integral to being able to reliably predict when it is going to happen, which is also true of weather phenomena. Imagine trying to learn to predict rainfall based on only a sample of rainy days. Right? If your sample contains only rainy days, it'll be hard for you to generalize to real weather situations, because sometimes it doesn't rain. Right? At the very least, you'll have lots of false alarms, right, if you try to learn in that way. And that, by the way, has been one of the limiting factors with asynchronous brain-computer interfaces. It's hard to keep the false alarm rate low when you don't know when, right? When the BCI has to decide when, the limiting factor in its performance is false alarms, or are false alarms. So beware of movement-locked epochs and time locking in the presence of autocorrelated autocorrelated time series. Another caveat. This one's a little bit more technical, but you want to make sure that the classifier only has access to information that's inside of the sliding window. We talked about, yeah.
So just like small detail, like when they chose like this like remote baseline, that was chose like randomly. It was chose immediately after the movement.
The previous movement? No, it was
immediately after the previous movement.
It was from 2,400 milliseconds to 2,000 milliseconds before the movement, and it was pretty arbitrary.
Okay.
It was far back enough that it probably was before any readiness potential would have appeared.
Okay.
But if I remember correctly from the paper, that there wasn't any principled reason for that choice.
Okay.
So this is another caveat. I've seen this problem in a couple of papers. So typically, when we filter, we want to get rid of the phase shift that the filter induces. So if you do this in MATLAB, you use field-field, which means you filter in the forward and the reverse direction. But this is it's a non-causal filter, right? It means that you can have if you have an impulse here, you can have, and this is an impulse that's after time 0, right? If you filter with a non-causal filter, you can have information about this impulse leak back in time to before the impulse, before time 0. So here's what happens if you use causal filter, if you use a non-causal filter, you get this gradual decay of your signal back in time. That's an artifact of the filter. I was talking to one guy who was doing a study, and he found, I could look at low frequencies, and I could do a pretty good job of predicting what was happening next. And I said, well, were you using a causal or non-causal filter? No, I was using a non-causal filter. It didn't work when I used a non-causal filter. So, okay, so always filter in the forward direction only. So, and I think I have one more caveat. So, in the time since Libet's experiment, there have been lots and lots of replications of it, lots of studies looking at it from various different angles. But in terms of this debate that he opened about free will, the next papers, the next studies that really had a big impact were not until about 2008, when Soon from John Dillon Haynes' lab came out with this paper about unconscious determinants of free decisions in the human brain. So they used fMRI data, and they later did a follow-up study in PNAS a few years later. So I'll quickly describe these studies and explain what I think is the sort of kosher interpretation of this work. So in the first paper, they had subjects freely decide to either press a button with their right index finger or with their left index finger. So in they replaced Libet's clock with a stream of letters that appeared on the screen. And so all the subject had to do was remember which letter was on the screen when you were first aware of your decision to press the right or left button. And then you press the button. Very simple task. And then they're showed 4 symbols here, and they just have to choose the one that corresponded to the symbol that was on the screen when they made their decision. What was really amazing about this study was that they could predict something like 8 seconds before the subject actually made the decision. They could predict how the subject was going to decide based on activity in a few different regions, notably the lateral frontopolar cortex, and in a couple of other different areas. So this paper had a particularly big impact. It wasn't long after this paper came out that I think it was the Atlantic magazine came out with an article saying it was entitled, "There's no such thing as free will." I'll talk about both of these studies together because they're very similar. What's different about this? The second study they published was that they tried to look at abstract intentions. So these were not motor intentions. The subject had to form an intention to either add or subtract 2 numbers. And again, in this case, they could classify quite far back in time, on the order of some seconds, whether the subject was going to choose to add or subtract before they had made up their mind, right? Before they had even been presented with the choice. So what these 2 studies have in common, importantly, a key detail is that yes, the classifier is significantly above chance, but it's not particularly accurate, right? Given that the guessing rate is 50%, being 58 or 60% is not particularly astounding, right? It's above chance. But think about it this way. Imagine if you couldn't predict at all what the subject's choice was going to be based on the brain activity preceding it. That would in fact be dualist, wouldn't it? As if the decision came from out of nowhere. But of course the decision came from your brain, right? So it has to be that to some degree the preceding brain states act as a sort of causal milieu, right? A sort of tendency. There might be a tendency to respond one way or the other. It doesn't necessarily mean that it fixes the fact, right? 58% correct doesn't tell me that the classifier that the brain has fixed the fact of what decision it's going to make in the future. And of course, I think this is what Haynes himself believes. Here's a quote from him. If you believe that the brain is governed by the laws of nature and that our decisions are realized by our brain, then our decisions should not be completely unrelated to brain activity ongoing in the recent past. Right? Simple enough. Above chance prediction alone is far from disproving free will or conscious will. And even if you were to decide with 99% accuracy, you would still need to demonstrate that the prior brain activity necessarily leads to the subsequent action. So the key caveat here is that in this particular case, it's not enough to say, oh, my classifier was above chance, right? The classifier accuracy matters. If the moment that you're interested in, right, this moment of a decision or this moment of a commitment, that ought to fix the fact of the decision that you're going to make in the future. And if it fixes the fact, then your classifier should be performing not just slightly above chance, but it should be performing quite well. And you could say, oh, well, as technology gets better and so on, when we have a better technology, that fMRI, it will get better. And say, okay, maybe it will, but it hasn't yet. So
would you be prepared to fix a threshold, say 95%?
I think my rule of thumb would be 75–80% would be. If you were lower than that, I would just still be suspicious. But if you were above 75 or say 80%, I think that starts to become newsworthy, because that's good enough that it suggests, well, that's equivalent to perfect performance minus measurement error.
If you take a step back from this, there seems to be bigger caveat. Basically, there is a very dark room that contains a very complicated machine, and you press a microphone to the wall of this room, and you pick up the sound of a billion gears grinding. And this sound decreases, this increasing complicated whirring noise, and then it slightly falls off a little bit, and then there's the big bump because the machine performs a movement. And this is roughly what's happening here. And you make a model of what's happening, what these gears are actually achieving, and so on. And there are many, many stories that you could tell about what these gears are doing based on the increasing whirring of the noise. So, for instance, there is the pandemonium theory of Selfridge that led to strongly influenced Society of Mind, Minsky's work. And the idea is that you have a bunch of agents that are on the stage, the demons, and they like to perform on the stage together, and they learn which actions give them rewards from the audience. And basically they get, the play or the performance on the stage gets into a certain area based on their previous learning, they get more and more excited and try to get on the stage. And at some point they cross this threshold and actually go on the stage. And they have the property that they also try to push some others off stage and pull some of their friends on stage. So these demons, these agents, have the property that they tend to form particular kinds of configurations which they have learned are good in certain environmental circumstances to achieve a certain thing, which could be the execution of a motor action, right? And then you see there's this threshold before they go on stage where you have these mounting attractors, and until you basically fall into the attractor, and this readiness potential basically seems to be showing that something falls into an attractor and then performs a particular kind of thing once it is there, right? And these things happen on stage, and you have them doing things on stage. Now, what they are doing on stage and how much this is a very distributed system or very modular and so on is something that you can in principle not discern with the kind of resolution that you have from your measurement, right? So a friend of mine, he did a number of Libet experiments informally, and he found that he was much faster than the Libet subjects in terms of making his decisions. And then he tried to figure out why, and he found that a number of his friends were also faster, but most of them were not. And he tried to figure out what that was, and he asked people, what do you think while you wait for pressing the button? And he found that most people think, not yet, not yet, not yet, now. Yeah. And he realized he is not thinking any words when he does this. He rarely engages words when he is waiting. He only turns on language when he needs it. And so he found that basically the engagement of the language center seems to pipe your decision loops through an additional process that influences this. This is something that's not being measured. It's something that Libet wasn't even aware because he didn't have enough subjects for that particular thing. So people might get to these decisions in very different ways. And if you take one step further away from this whole discussion, I don't think it is even related to freedom of will, right? There is an idea of freedom of will in philosophy which is founded in dualism. If we are not dualists but good old mechanists, you know, there is a number of gears in your brain that need to grind to make you do a thing. And our neurons are very slow, so they're going to grind for a long time. And you're not aware of the fact that they do this because you're not informed about the way in which you make your decision, right? So the freedom of decision does not have to do with the fact whether there is a hypothetical agent from an outside universe that can remote your control your brain instantly, as Libet seemed to have thought because he was a dualist.
Yeah.
Dualism largely does not work. It's a theory that very few people subscribe to, right? So we probably want to have a free will definition that is independent of dualism. And it turns out that free will is probably the ability to do what you think is the right thing to do, which means you make a model of your purposes. That model of your purposes ought to be isomorphic to what you're actually regulating for. And if that model predicts what you think you should have been doing in the situations, then you have subjectively the impression that you were acting on your own free will. And the opposite to this is not determinism or coercion, it's compulsion, right? It's when you do something that is violating what you think is the right thing to do.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so it's a very different definition that has relatively little to do with what we see here.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it's up to us to define what we mean by free will, and there are other definitions.
No, but I'm not sure if you guys are saying the same thing, because I think Aaron's result also show us that then in this operational definition of free will, where indeed this dualistic interpretation, like, oh, the brain is already knowing stuff before you know it, right? That also those interpretations have been exaggerated. This is your point. It's also a methodological point, right? So,
Yeah.
but I think that even before we go back to the discussion about, okay, to what extent is consciousness then disengaged or engaged with the decision making, maybe now we should also go back to the core results, because in some sense, well, I don't know if how many slides you've left, because we had discussion.
I'm almost done.
Because you're also saying that Soon or Dylan Haynes are in some sense just wrong, or at least exaggerating their claims.
They're not wrong. I mean, their data are
Or irrelevant. No, they say many seconds before you make the movement, I can predict it because they make these methodological errors. So what's left?
It just depends on what you mean by predict. That's all. I mean, to be able to classify what the action is going to be or what the choice is going to be at slightly above chance, I don't debate that. They can do
Well,
that.
wait, Aaron, I know you're a nice guy, okay, but forget it for a second.
Okay.
If we would rewrite the Soon paper, but now methodologically you do it correctly, what would be left of that result? Both of them, right?
I don't think there's anything wrong with their study methodologically. I just think it's the interpretation that's wrong.
But in the first study they talked about 8 seconds prior to movement. Would the 8 seconds still stand?
Sure.
I think so.
Well,
so.
what did they do wrong in that?
Well,
So what you can do is you
Yeah,
can
did
tell
they
the person,
autocorrelation?
press the right or left button, and this button lights up before you press it. Because you make a predictor in your brain, on the person's brain, and tells them which button they're going to press, and you tell them, press the button you decide to press unless it lights up.
They did this experiment.
Yeah, they did.
Schultz-Kraft. That's a more recent one, and that's probably a better way to try and get at the same question. But I don't think there's anything necessarily methodologically wrong again about what they did. Certainly their results were susceptible to autocorrelation.
Mm-hmm.
But so it just means that there is a process by which prior brain states influence upcoming brain states. That's totally reasonable. And they identified some regions in the brain that are playing a role in that process. So from that point of view, it's not like they did something wrong. It's just that the media really put this interpretation on it that it doesn't deserve.
If we would redo the analysis, taking now these caveats into account, right, the 8 seconds might change.
Maybe.
We
Maybe
don't
the
know
8
that.
seconds would evaporate, yeah.
Okay, that's the point.
Yeah, that's true. So you can argue, well, that the hardcore definition of free will as an uncaused cause, that just doesn't make sense. You can't do anything with that scientifically, right? So you can make an argument, a principled argument that free will doesn't exist. But if you want to make an argument based on empirical data, I'm going to say, well, my data are inconsistent with the possibility of free will or of conscious will. Well, my point here is that we don't have that kind of data yet. So we could, it's possible, if you were able to predict what people were doing 95% correct, 7 or 8 seconds in advance, then we'd be having a different sort of conversation. But we don't have that kind of data yet. And if, I like to say this, a single brain is arguably more complicated than the entirety of the Earth's atmosphere, right? And look at how difficult it is to predict the weather just 1 or 2 days. You go 2 days out, 3 days out, and in a lot of, I mean, of course, if you're in the Sahara Desert, it's easy, but if you're in a lot of places in this world, it gets really hard really quickly. So what makes us think that it'll be so easy, that we'll just take, machine learning, brain data, right, we'll be able to predict. I'm not saying that's not ultimately possible, but I think it's a bit of hubris on our part to think that it's going to be easy somehow, or readily doable. So we don't have that kind of evidence yet, even though I think the evidence has been sold in that way. What I'm trying to sell you on is that you've been sold a bit of a falsehood. So what kind of evidence have I talked about so far? I've talked about this Libet type of evidence where you have a signature of a presumed signature of a decision preceding consciousness of having decided. So that's one kind of evidence against free will. There's the soon evidence, which is being able to predict behavior in advance based on brain activity. But there's a third kind of evidence which I didn't talk about, and I'll mention it briefly, which came from this anecdote about the experiment by Gray Walter. Has anybody heard of the Gray Walter anecdote? Okay, a few. This appeared as a footnote, I think it was, in Dan Dennett's book Consciousness Explained, and it appeared elsewhere. But so Dennett and Marshall Kinsborn were apparently at a meeting where Gray Walter was presenting some results that he never published. But they claimed that they were at the meeting and they took notes. And so that's why this remains an anecdote. It was never published. So according to the anecdote, what Gray Walter said was, well, I had these patients with electrodes implanted in their motor cortex for some other reason, for epilepsy monitoring or whatever. So I did this experiment where I had them look at a slideshow, and I gave them the button of the slide projector. At that time, it was an old-fashioned slide projector with the round tray, and it would go to make a big clicking noise before every slide advanced. He gave them the button and just said, watch the slideshow and press the button when you want to advance the slides. But what he didn't tell the subjects was that, or the patients, was that the button was a dummy. It wasn't even plugged in, and the slide projector was being driven by a signal from their motor cortex. And according to the anecdote, the patients spontaneously reported they felt as if the slide was advancing just before they were aware of their own desire to advance it. Not before they had actually pressed the button, but even before they were aware that it was as if the slide projector knew what I wanted before I knew what I wanted. That kind of evidence is hard to argue with. But at this point, it remains an anecdote. With the way brain-computer interfaces are advancing, it shouldn't be too long before someone will be able to do this kind of experiment, which I think is probably the way to go if you want to do this kind of research. Of course, ethically there may be some problems and so on, or there certainly are some problems, but given the importance that attaches itself to the theme of free will, one might get permission to do that sort of experiment.
Doesn't that fall in the range where Peter Hager would talk about this intentional binding? That you have sort of time warping because of the sense of agency over an event?
Yeah, so when you cause an event, you feel as if your action was a little bit closer in time to the event, and the outcome was a little bit earlier in time. But intentional binding brings them a little bit closer together, but it doesn't switch their order.
But isn't Gray Walter talking about a phenomenon that would fall into that category of subjective states? Time warping, essentially.
I suppose. I mean, it certainly is suggestive that the feeling of having decided is something that's concocted based on the information that comes from maybe before the movement, but also after as well.
Right.
Which there's TMS evidence for that.
So maybe it's less mysterious than it appeared at first glance.
Maybe, and it could also be. I mean, one other possibility for the you have to be aware of with the Gray Walter anecdote is that these could be. It's possible that these were false alarms that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So maybe you'd imagine the subject is, let's say, very close to the motor threshold, very close to pressing the button. But let's say that if you could play time back again, they would not have pressed the button, right? Except that because they were very close to the threshold, Gray Walter's very simple BCI, which was him just applying another threshold, basically, maybe made a false alarm, triggering the advancing of the slide, which makes a clicking noise. And because the subject was so close to the threshold anyway, the clicking noise actually tipped the scales and made the subject move, right? And then, of course, you'd have the feeling that it antedated your movement or your decision, because you weren't going to even move in the first place if you could play back time again.
Right.
So, has to be careful of that possibility as well.
Right.
But okay, so I think I'll stop there. That's because there's my last slide, and we can pause for discussion. This was taken by a friend of mine, Silvia Marcazotti. It's her still life. I think it's great.
Okay. You must be a nerd. Okay.
I am.
But you are.
I am.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Find the fruit in this still life. Okay? All right, it's question time. Who has a question for Aaron? Giovanni.
So, they understand well that according to the drift diffusion model that you presented, I'm going to repeat for the recording. Do you understand well that according to the drift diffusion model that you presented, the moment in which the subject will report the will to move coincides pretty much where the signal crosses the threshold of movement? Is this
According
correct?
to the model.
Huh?
Yes.
Qualitative model.
According to the model.
According to the model.
Right.
Okay, so does this support the global workspace theory?
Of consciousness? I think it's pretty unrelated. So, I mean, I don't see any clear way that they, I mean, you could use global workspace theory to try to account for the conscious feeling of having decided.
But the awareness of having decided.
The awareness of having decided. But these particular data don't really speak to that in any way that I can think of.
Okay. I thought like it was much closer linked to what it is then.
Well, contractually, you are obliged to say some supporting words for the global workspace, I assume.
It's a good theory. It's among the good ones.
In Aaron's defense, you could argue that the readiness potential, right, that you observe, sits actually outside of your global workspace, because you are talking again back to the periphery. And the global workspace will be all about what goes on in a sort of central space of experience, right? So you could argue, well, this is a pure peripheral event. And it might be the inverse of ignition, right? In ignition, you enter from a perceptual state, it's now accessing the workspace, so you can pump up the energy if you want. And now you see the reverse. You pump up some energy to push it out again as a motor act. So these things are then indeed unrelated.
And you wouldn't want to be constantly conscious of movements that you almost made but didn't. Right? You only want to be conscious of the movements that you actually made. I mean, that would be a very disturbing existence.
And even those you don't be all aware of.
Not
You
always,
made lots of movements.
That you're, like that.
Exactly.
Thank you.
All right, more questions. So, okay.
So our null hypothesis is probably that when you make a decision like pressing a button, we have a bunch of brain areas that are premotor that interact and together produce this decision. And as the closer you get to the point where you actually happen to make that decision and perform the action, the more the activity will ramp up. And then at some point there will be a transition where you go over into your motor area to actually prepare the action and execute it, right? And I think this is roughly what you see in the readiness potential. So in which way does your experiment change your null hypothesis? What have you learned?
Well, we've learned not to interpret the data in the way we originally interpreted it, I guess, or the way Libet interpreted his data. Those very same processes are probably subject to drift. They're probably drifting around randomly. And so we've learned that they might participate in the decision-making process via a threshold, but we've learned what not to read into this pre-threshold activity, right? Just like I like to think of it as something like Lamarck's giraffes, right? So you see, so Lamarck saw these skeletons of giraffes with their neck getting longer over evolutionary time, thought, well, the giraffe was trying to do something, and that effort, right, led to the offspring having a longer neck and so on. So you see something building up over time, and it's sort of a cognitive illusion. You tend to infuse it with effort, with trying, with wanting, with something having been decided. And it's the same maybe with the readiness potential. You see this thing building up over time, leading to a movement, and the immediate tendency is to think, oh, well, this is the brain deciding and getting ready to move. That doesn't have to be necessarily the case.
But Aaron, there's another problem that I cannot resolve yet, and I need your help for that. So I think you exist in two universes. On the one hand, if I get your analysis right, you're saying, well, the Libet result and everything that came after that was at best a caricature of what's really going on in this physiological system.
Very best.
Right? And this also, this slow buildup of activity that people have seen might be more an artifact of analysis methods than anything else, right?
Yeah.
But that Aaron made a model, a drift diffusion model, that explained actually the slow buildup. Right?
Yeah.
Then the metamorphosed Aaron analyzed the methodology and said, hey, actually the original readiness potential idea is wrong. It might be a much more discrete transition. It might be, the shape of the curve might look actually dramatically different.
Right.
So didn't you, with that, severely handicapped Aaron 1 to proceed his career of advancing drift diffusion models of the readiness potential? Because Aaron 2 has shown that it's actually based on an artifact.
Well, but what I find interesting about it is that it's not just an artifact, it's an interesting artifact. It's an artifact that tells you something about what's going on under the hood. So it suggests that there's an accumulation to bound process that underlies self-initiated movements, and that maybe the brain hasn't reinvented decision making for the purpose of doing them in a self-initiated way versus doing them in response to a stimulus, using the same mechanism.
Wait, but if I take your analysis, if I understand it, the real signal that's playing out in the brain might be actually sort of a rather constant state with a very rapid transition, close to the action. You also showed an example of that, right?
Right.
Now, to do that, drift diffusion not going to help me, because the whole point about drift diffusion is the slow build-up, and that's also what the physiology often correlates with. There's
Right.
all idea of a slow accumulation.
Okay, so
Right? So the whole slow accumulation is just not there. We're like, bang, we're going to go for it.
I know you don't like the drift diffusion model. So
Oh,
I'll-
really? Did I?
So okay, I'll
It's wrong. Okay.
I'll tell you the secret. I'll tell you the
Okay,
secret.
good.
I'll tell you the secret. I mean, I like the way we've applied the drift diffusion model, just because it's a simple model. It explains a lot in a very parsimonious way, and it's gone a long way in the literature on perceptual decision making. So that's good. It kind of ties things together in a nice way. It makes for a richer, more interesting story. But when I was first working on this, well, I can still do it. I can fit the readiness potential without any drift diffusion process. All I have to do is take some white noise, pinkify it, make it pink, and wait for threshold crossings and align to those threshold crossings an average, and I get something that looks like the readiness potential. But of course, there's nothing principled behind it. I'm just throwing pink noise at a threshold and so on. So using the drift diffusion model was a way to put something sort of more principled behind this. But you can get this fitting. All that you need, the minimal ingredients, is autocorrelated noise and a threshold. And it just so happens that a drift diffusion process produces autocorrelated.
You can see what he's doing here, right? He's diffusing your beliefs until you drift into his model.
Okay. All right. On that conclusion, Tony has a question.
It's really more of a comment. I mean, I think this whole debate seems to me to be founded on a complete misunderstanding of what the human condition is. You know, this idea that we are this blip of rational consciousness sitting atop this pillar of stupid meat, and that's the only thing that allows us to make sensible decisions. Clearly, the opposite is true. That consciousness, to the extent it exists at all, is really just a reflection of lots of unconscious brain processes that we are able to introspect about in some interesting way, but we're not making decisions. As you say, there can't be uncaused causes. Right. So even when we're thinking rationally, we are thinking primarily subconsciously. That there is a stream of conscious thought in that reasoning process, but the process of reasoning rationally must involve lots of subconscious processes as well. So the whole argument about whether or not decision making is conscious seems to me to be a bit of a non-starter. Decision making is clearly 99% non-conscious, because that's the nature of what we are.
You want to automate it as much as you can.
Well, or we don't want to make this mistake of thinking that the only decisions that count are the ones that we believe we have made consciously, because every decision we make, and people like Damasio have shown that we make poor decisions if we ignore the signals that are coming from our bodies, which are certainly reaching us subconsciously. There's data showing that the number of people called George who live in Georgia is statistically higher than you expect, and it's because people called George, sort of migrate to Georgia subconsciously. Yeah. So I mean, I think we probably just need to take this whole area of research and say, look, we're asking the wrong kinds of questions here. I mean, I think your studies are very neat in showing that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think that the model tells us that's interesting is that the feeling of having decided might be meaningful, might not be completely meaningless. It might be the brain's best guess at the moment at which the threshold was actually crossed. And maybe it's a noisy guess, like I said before, but still, maybe it's not such a bad guess after all. So I find that interesting, that this subjective feeling of having made a decision might not be something that's completely tacked on after after the fact might mean something.
All right, on those words, thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you.